well, we'll get started. I want to thank you all so much for coming out to join us tonight for this Stamford Education Roundtable and what will surely be an invigorating evening of vital discussion. My name is Brian Coors, and I am the Managing Director of Strategic Partnerships for the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, FAIR, as we're known. And together with the Prometheum Foundation, we are proud to bring you this event tonight. Sadly, one of our panelists, Ian Rowe, was unable to make it this evening due to a sudden death in the family. So I would like to take a moment of silence among us to hold him and his family and anybody else who may be going through a struggle in the light, if we could. Thank you. Moments like those, I think, remind us of our common humanity. And if education were a simple issue, we'd have surely figured it out by now. And because it's a complex issue with many layers, with many components, it's so important that we are able to talk about it and to talk about it with civility, with openness, while respecting one another's common humanity. We have so much more in common than we do apart, and we can get through these kinds of conversations. And tonight we have a perfect opportunity. You will hear disagreement, you will hear interesting, thought-provoking things, and you will hear it done with great civility, great respect and openness. So we are thrilled to have you here, and pretty soon we will have a member of your community, a mother of 3 and longtime Stamford resident, Karen Laureano-Ricardson, who will be here to introduce your star-studded panel, which is a mixture of in-person and Zoom in our modern world. But before we do that, we are going to have one more wonderful musical performance. I should mention just quickly that the organization I work for, FAIR, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit. We're dedicated to promoting a common culture of fairness, understanding, and humanity, and advancing civil liberties, advancing our society through those means. So we are thrilled to have you here. The group that is with us tonight is from Project Music. This is another nonprofit, a music education nonprofit that's dedicated to bringing the joy of music and life skills to young people who might be restricted financially otherwise from getting to enjoy these kinds of activities. And we are delighted to have them with us tonight. And what fabulous music they've already provided. And before Karen comes up to introduce our panelists, we're going to hear one more tune, a number called Kitchen Blues, Project Music.
Well done. Thank you, Project Music. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. As a multi-decade resident of Stamford, I'm proud to be here today and open this forum for discussion with some amazing panelists. And I'll start right away with descriptions of all of them. To my immediate left is Bob King. Bob King is a former chair of Stamford Board of Education. He's a former Army veteran. He retired from IBM as a top executive and is a member of the NAACP and is a co-chair member of the Discovery of Amistad's board. Next to him is Dana Stangel-Plowe, and she's the director of educational programs and networks at FAIR, and is a former educator herself and a lawyer who was, before coming here, an English teacher. So that's awesome. And next to him is Andrew. So Drew Denbaum. Who's an English teacher and just corrected my English at West Hill, and who's a town at Community College. And then joining us virtually, welcome, gentlemen, we have Q.R. Guskey, a PhD and an educator, let's see, from the University of Kentucky. He's authored over 25 award-winning books in education. And he has obviously dedicated his career to helping teachers and school leaders in the quality of education in terms of research to ensure that everyone has the benefit of having successful academic careers. Next to him is Joe Feldman, and he does not need much of an introduction. He is the founder and CEO of Crescendo Education Group. He is the author of the Grading for Equity. I am just really on my English today. I apologize. He is the author, Grading, and what it is, why it matters, and how it can transform classrooms. Joe has worked in education for over 20 years as a teacher, a principal, and district administrator, and is the founder and CEO of Crescendo Education Group. And now to our Roundtable moderator, we have Mr. Stephen Powell. He is an entrepreneur who has worked and has several U.S. patents, it says here, which is great. Heads the Prometheum Foundation, a nonprofit philosophical organization that helps to teach students and with critical and analytical thinking and the freedom of thought. And we welcome you to our panel. So thank you, everyone.
Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to have a conversation about education, a free exchange of ideas. While we will try to cover as many topics as we can, we do have limited time. So please understand that we may not have a chance to get to every issue of interest. For that reason, I've asked the panelists to be as concise as possible so we can discuss as many topics as we can. Also, I know everyone was handed a card to put questions on, so if you want to fill those out and you have a question, Sarah from AITE will come around and collect them if you have any questions. There's Sarah there. Panel. Before we get into specifics of what our schools should or should not be doing, we need to first get a clear perspective of why we send our kids to school. Briefly, in a sentence or two, if you can, what is the purpose of school? What are we trying to achieve by sending our children to school? Bob?
From my humble opinion, I think that we all send our children to school for the purpose of learning how to read, write, do arithmetic, also to help them become critical thinkers, preparing them for life's challenges, and also to be able to share their strengths and understand their weaknesses, so as they grow older, they can develop themselves. I look at education, I believe in lifelong learners. At my age, I'm still learning. So that's what I believe in. That's why I think I sent my children to school, and I feel that I've gotten a return on my investment of their time.
Tom, do you want to go next?
Sure. I think that, first of all, I want to thank everybody for being a part of the session, for inviting me to be a part of the session tonight. I'm really honored to be a part of the group. We send our kids to school, I think, as Bob said, to really become better thinkers, to be members of our society, to understand our culture, to gain appreciation of other cultures that are part of our society and this diverse array of people that live together and have formed our country, and then to not only understand our society, but to really think about ways to make it better, to ask important questions about how we're doing things currently and how those can be improved. So I think that this whole idea of what we're meeting for tonight is an excellent example of that, to not accept things naturally as given, but to always be questioning, always be thinking about ways that we've come to understand what we do and ways we can make it better.
Joe?
This question gets progressively harder the farther down in the number of panelists it goes.
It can be brief,
I
though. Yep. No,
I
just
also want to thank FAIR and everyone for being on the panel. It's wonderful to be a part of this conversation, this kind of a forum. I really, really appreciate this approach to having civil discourse about ideas that can be controversial or just new. The only thing I would add, I thought Mr. King and Professor Guskey addressed so many important elements of what education is for. I think the other thing I think about is that particularly in a democracy, we're trying to help give opportunities to all students and be able to equip them regardless of their backgrounds and experiences, and even to utilize those backgrounds and experiences to enable every child to be successful for whatever may come.
Dana?
It is very hard to add to all of that. I, coming from an English teacher background, I think we need a literate, informed population in order to maintain a free democracy. That means also including in that is the joy of learning and having the introduction to education for students be a way for them to discover themselves and others, and the thrill of that discovery being the beginning of lifelong learning.
True.
All of the classes that I teach are focused on higher order thinking. And this comes as a surprise to many of my students. School for me is focused on nurturing and inspiring students to figure out who they are. Right now, we're studying Invisible Man, where the narrator has no name. And we wonder why. We talk about why. And even though I'm teaching seniors, they're really just at the cusp of figuring out who they are. So nurturing them and inspiring them to find their identity and to be confident in that is a very important part of school, I think.
Let me just share with you Randy Weingarten's view of this, I guess. She's the president of the American Federation of Teachers, and she said in a symposium, so I hope I'm getting this right for her, but she said, the purpose is to prepare young people for life, citizenship, college, and career. She was a little more succinct, I think, than everyone. But that's one view from the Federation of Teachers. Also, the mission of the Stamford Public Schools is to provide an education that cultivates productive habits of mind, body, and heart in every student. So panel, with having thought about that a little, should part of the school's primary mission be to teach behaviors that are consistent with societal or workplace expectations, such as meeting deadlines, personal responsibility, following instructions, preparation? Or does focusing on these behavioral aspects detract from the school's other objectives? Let's start with Joe.
I mean, the schools are designed and should be teaching about all kinds of skills. And I think workplace is sort of an interesting description because really society requires all kinds of expectations around meeting deadlines, being kind, respectful, being a good listener, as well as being able to critically think, creatively problem solve. I mean, there's a whole host of things, including how do you collaborate and how do you manage projects and how do you speak in a public forum? How do you advocate for yourself? I think the list of skills and content that schools are expected to teach is almost infinite and very, very difficult for schools to figure out what the right balance is for all those things. And they all are important. And they aren't just taught in schools. They're taught in lots of places, in the families and communities and other institutions. So I think really schools are just part of the education that students receive from all kinds of ways. And I think the challenge is to think about how do they make those skills meaningfully understood by students, not as rote behaviors, but as something that students really internalize the value of those things. The last thing I'll say is that, I think workplace is a little bit of a problematic concept because the workplace that we're in right now is not the workplace that our students will enter and that they will sort of grow into. So we're doing our best to predict the kind of workplace that they'll enter with some of the kind of core skills and ways of being. And we want to be careful not to pigeonhole students into particular ways of being that deprive them of creativity, of depriving them of authenticity, particularly when a lot of what we imagine the workplace to be is a prediction at best.
Okay. Dana, are these behavioral traits important enough to make it part of the school's purpose or mission, or are they not?
I think they're certainly important. And I think they do belong as part of a school's mission, but I think there are different ways of getting at that mission. One of the things that I really strive to do as a teacher was to be a good role model. I would never appear in class, for example, late. And that's just a very simple example of how to model what my expectations were. I treated everybody, or strive to treat everybody with respect and kindness and set that expectation within my classroom so we could form an academic community, which was what was required in order to do the learning. So yes, I do think behavior is part of a school's mission, but I think it's woven into how a classroom can be managed.
Okay. Bob?
Yeah. I agree with everything that has been said, but I would like to add just a couple of caveats to it. I think that the school actually, through its teachers, and when teachers are able to model the kind of behavior they expect, it only enhances the student. I think we as a community have to do the same thing, because regardless of what the workplace looks like, everyone expects high level of service. I don't think there's a person here that goes to a restaurant that doesn't expect a waiter to wait on them and expect them to give them high levels of service. That's why we leave tips. And our kids, our young people need to understand that. One of the things that you will learn, you say, well, why do children who play sports do so well? Because no one expects, no one provides them with low expectations. They are expected to win. And they're also expected to work hard. And our students need to have the same behavioral expectation. We know that they can, right? And as Dana said, as a teacher, she took it upon herself to be the role model of expectation. My sons grew up at a school where to be early was to be on time. To be late, to be on time was to be late, and men from their school were never late. So what's that message to that child? That message is, hey, be early because we're going to start the work as soon as everyone's here. So I feel as the school can do that for us.
Sure.
Part of the complexity of the situation, though, I think, is that students come, especially in high school, with a concept of themselves as a student. And many, many, many of them feel inadequate to the task. And to protect themselves from feeling that, their behaviors may not conform with expectations. And so to just tell them how to behave, or even to model how to behave, may not get through to them, may not be meaningful to them. So you have to find a way in. For me, the way in is by helping them understand that whatever it is we're reading, to approach it in a thematic way, and that whether it's taking place now or in the 1930s, like Invisible Man, or in the 1600s, the characters are experiencing things, the society is going through things that they can make a personal connection to, and it can be relevant to them. Now, they may certainly resist that. They may not even come fully conscious to class. And I'm not just talking about first period, it can be in the middle of the day or the end of the day. But to wake them up and help them to make that connection, that is a more roundabout way of influencing their behavior in a positive way.
Let me just ask you, so do you think it's important enough to include in the purpose or mission, or is it more of a yes, we're also going to do that?
It's certainly important enough to be part of the mission, but it has to be understood, or it should be understood, that to just approach it head on may not work, and may not work for an awful lot of students. And because we understand that they're individuals and we want them to self-actualize, we can't browbeat them into behavior.
Okay. Thomas, how do you feel about this?
Well, I would agree with what our other panelists have said, certainly. I would note too that increasingly we're getting evidence from a couple of different sources that these sort of non-academic skills are critically important. The college admissions process, for example, has found that there are factors other than just students' grades in school that contribute to their success in college and their life beyond. Studies of highly successful people also indicate that just their academic prowess is not enough to lead to their success in their careers, that we really need to be developed skills. The challenge we face is this adds to the burden of teachers. We've always expected teachers to be responsible for teaching these academic skills, but now we're turning around and saying, well, you need to teach your students how to work in teams. You need to teach them how to be collaborative. You need to teach them respect for other cultures. You need to teach them a sense of resilience in the face of difficulty and failure. And so, although we can push for these additional things, we also have to recognize the challenge that that's placing upon teachers to incorporate that within the school's mission or even the curriculum.
Let's talk a little about grading. Having discussed the purpose of schooling somewhat, how do we make periodic assessments to measure a student's progress? Traditionally, schools have used grades, A through F, for example. Currently, the Stamford public school system is re-examining its grading practices. One of its high schools is actually piloting new methods. Are traditional letter or number grades an accurate measure of achievement and comprehension, or should the system be changed? If so, how? Joe, I'm going to start with you again, if you don't mind. I think you have something to say about grades.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, so I was an educator for 20 years, and grades always nagged at me. It was something I never quite got a handle on as a teacher or administrator. And then I was a parent and still didn't quite understand what these were supposed to represent. Right now, I'm a parent of a 15-year-old and an 11-year-old, both of whom are going on like 21. And then when I left working in a district, I started researching grading and found that it actually has a long history with lots of research around it, particularly of folks like Professor Guskey, who's done a tremendous amount of research into traditional grading practices, and finding that the ways that we grade are relatively fossilized from how they were from 100 years ago during the Industrial Revolution. And the problem isn't just that they're outdated or that they've been around a long time. It's that they actually are doing things that undermine our contemporary research and our understanding of what effective teaching and learning is. Teachers are using great methodology in classrooms and using great, diverse curriculum and higher order thinking and creativity, and yet they're often undermining a lot of their good work by using traditional grading practices. And one of the ironies is that teachers get no training in how to grade in their graduate programs or in alternate certification programs for the most part. And so most, like me, is replicating how we were graded, and that has been going on for generations. And I was upset as an educator about that and frustrated about it, but it was even more frustrating in some ways as a parent, because the more I learned about traditional grading practices, the more I found that traditional grading actually creates inaccurate descriptions of where my students are for reasons we can talk about. But finding ways to make grading more accurate and more resistant to biases of teachers and more motivational to students is really what we want grading to be. And the research is pretty squarely behind a lot of improved practices. So it's worth revisiting some of the ways that we've assumed grading works and to find ways that it can be more successful, particularly for students who we've historically underserved in our schools, but they also benefit students who have historically benefited. So I think there's just a whole lot of reasons why we can do a lot better with our grading.
Can you tell me just, I know this is a big question, but how would you change it? Would you change the A through F? Would you change the numerical 1 through 100 or 0 through 100?
Well, you're asking two questions at once and opening up for a whole lot more. And Professor Guskey's smiling because he just knows this just goes on and on. I mean, I'm relatively agnostic about the letter grade. I mean, what matters to me is that it accurately describe a student's level of understanding of the course content. For the 0 to 100, it's a different problem that we can talk about in more detail. It's a scale that is actually, it's disproportionately oriented toward failure, and it actually pulls down grades disproportionately down, and it's not even mathematically sound in so many ways. And of course, 0 to 100 scale, no one in the professional work world uses the 0 to 100 scale to describe competence in anything. It's not on bar exams, medical boards, teacher credentialing, law exams. Nobody uses 0 to 100 scale, and elementary doesn't use it either most of the time. So we've really we're superimposing a scale that has lots of mathematical problems with it for about 7 years of a kid's life, because it's not even used in colleges. They curve it so much that it actually doesn't represent the scale oftentimes. So and I can go into the next layer down, or I could pass the baton to Professor Guskey, who's also written about how the 0 to 100 scale is so problematic in so many ways.
Well, Tom, I think you have a few things to say about grading as well.
Well, yes, and this is one of the classic issues that's a part of our country alone. We are so far behind the rest of the world when it comes to the way we grade. And in particular, what we tend to do throughout the United States is we combine all these diverse elements into a single grade and report it. Now, we know that teachers should grade according to criteria. But when we look at the criteria teachers use, we find that they fall into 3 different categories. And we've labeled those product, process, and progress. And product criteria are common demonstrations of student learning. You don't worry about how they got there. You worry about what they're able to do and what they can show you they've learned. Process criteria are behaviors that enable learning, but don't represent learning per se. So if you count homework as a part of the grade, you're grading in terms of process. If you count class participation, punctuality and turning assignments, all those are process criteria. And finally, we have progress. With progress, you don't worry about where they are, but how far they've come. It's sometimes referred to as improvement grading or value added gain grading. Now, we know that all 3 are important, but all 3 are distinct. And what gets us into trouble is when we combine all those into a single grade. And so the highly responsible low achiever gets exactly the same grade as the irresponsible high achiever. It miscommunicates about both. Now, the really odd part is if you go to other places around the world, if you go to like the Northern European countries, Scandinavian countries in particular, if you go to places in Asia, if you go to Canada and look at the report cards, they don't give a single grade. They give a band of grades. They report these things separately. And so they've done this for decades. And so the kids get an achievement grade that represents those academic goals, but then they'll get a separate grade for homework, a separate grade for class participation. Now, when I saw their system, my first thought was, well, it looks great, but it looks like a lot of extra work. And they turned to me and said, it's easier than what you silly people do in the States. We collect the same information as you. We just don't worry about combining it at the end. And so all those fights you have about how you weight stuff, we don't deal with it. We keep it separate. And the teachers there love it because they find kids take homework a lot more seriously when they get a separate grade for homework. It's no longer counted as part of their achievement grade. They also like it because if a parent questions them on achievement grade, they can say, well, look over here. Maybe if your child started participating more in class, maybe if they started completing homework, the achievement grade go up. And finally, and Joe knows this well, it's a major factor with regard to equity, because oftentimes these non-achievement factors are things over which kids don't have control. And so often we're lowering their grades because of these factors over which they really can't control. Maybe they come from homes where there's no quiet place for them to get away to do homework. Maybe they come from a home where as soon as they get home, they're called upon to take on other family responsibilities like childcare for younger siblings. And when we include all that as part of the grade, it lowers their grade. It lowers their actual picture of what they've done in ways that are really unfair and unequitable. The way to get around that is just to mark it separately, give a profile of grades where all these things we put in separately. It's less work, it's fair, and it's far more equitable.
Okay. Drew, do you have should we be changing the way we do grades? Should we, are they comprehensive? Do we need to do a new system?
Well, I'm certainly very open-minded about how to approach this, but there are a few points I'd like to make. First of all, with reference to zero, my approach to that has, yes.
I'm sorry, miss, but this is not appropriate for this. I'm sorry. It's not appropriate. This is not that type of discussion. Drew, please go on.
Okay.
I'm sorry, but this is not about identity. It's about ideas.
Okay.
Mire, primeramente, gracias por tener la voz. Es muy importante que todos nosotros estemos aquí para el bienestar de los niños. Yo como latina sé exactamente en qué posición están y le aplaudo que tengan el bienestar de poder venir y hablar. Pero el punto de hoy es simplemente darle una voz a todos. Y aquí hay más de 70 idiomas que se hablan y mientras tanto, los latinos que hay somos bastante, pero aún ni estamos unidos. So, tenemos que hacer mucho y estamos aquí para ayudar. Ya para largo plazo lo que vamos a hacer es hacer una traducción para poder hacerlo y ya tener la tecnología, lo vamos a hacer, ¿ok? Pero para tener el respeto del formato que tenemos ahora, yo creo que es prudente que nosotros hagamos eso separadamente, ¿ok? ¿Sí? Sí, yo soy latina. Sí, claro, por supuestamente. Lo que nosotros tenemos que tener es un latino que tenga la voz, pero eso no es el punto de este formato. ¿Ah?
I'm sorry, we need to get back to work.
I will. Claro, pero mire, para hacerle todo el respeto, tenemos que hablar de todos los estudiantes, sea usted blanco, sea de lo que sea, no importa. Es simplemente tener todo para todos los estudiantes. Claro, sin duda. I will. Yes. Sí. Eso es lo que estamos haciendo. Eso es lo que estamos haciendo. Gracias por su opinión.
We're going to continue. Drew, go ahead. Of course we are, because this is about ideas. And you haven't heard any of what we're talking about. We haven't heard anything. This is about ideas. Wait till after to criticize it, at least. Drew.
Okay.
Yes, you are. Yes, this is a public forum. You are. You do not have to sit here. You do not have to listen. Drew, please continue. Sorry, everyone. Sorry, gentlemen. Drew, go ahead.
All right. The first point that I wanted to make about zero is only if a student does nothing is a zero an accurate indication of what they have done. And I've discussed this with my students a number of times, and at least what they say to me is that that makes sense, because my policy is that if a student makes any effort whatsoever and contributes something that comes out of their head, even if it's just a sentence, if it's relevant to the prompt, I give them 55 points. But I'm at an advantage as an English teacher. There's no right or wrong. All I expect from my students is for them to engage with the material, think about it, and formulate an idea. So the grade that gets put on that is in the context of the standards that the school system and the country has adopted. You all saw the report that came out this morning about how throughout the United States, including in Connecticut, the math and reading proficiency levels according to those standards, only about 30% of fourth graders and eighth graders are at a proficiency level. But in my classroom, students who come with tremendous variation in their readiness in terms of those standards can do well, can feel a sense of accomplishment and appreciation and value from me, because they can bring their own perspective, their own experience, whatever that is, and not feel that I'm going to be judging them according to another student or according to my own expectations. If a student comes to me with something that I never would have thought of in a million years, it's fantastic. That's wonderful. And I say to them, I expect to get a different response from every single one of you, because it's coming from you, from your thoughts, from your life and your appreciations and your dislikes and whoever you are. So I guess I'm at an advantage because there is no right or wrong from that standpoint. But to do nothing, to come in and go to sleep, yes, that's a behavioral issue that has to be dealt with, but we shouldn't tell them that they're getting credit for that.
Okay. Dana, what do you think? We have a, traditionally A to F. I mean, should that be changed? Is it not?
I don't have a problem with the A to F as long as they're clearly defined as to what they mean. When I think I saw in Mr. Feldman's book a chart that laid out something like, and I apologize if I'm getting this wrong, something like A exceeds expectation, B meets expectations, C needs improvement, and so on. I think the most important thing about grades is that they communicate to the students what they're doing well and what they need to work on.
Robert?
Yeah, so I wasn't the best student, but I've worked with a lot of bright people. right? But let me share with you. My position on that would be, and I like what I heard about Canada. I sit on a board where we focus on life skills, where these are for adults. And the value of life skills continue to outweigh grades in a lot of circles. And that's because the world around us have changed. You know, no one knows what Bill Gates got as grades. What do you know about Bill Gates? Do you care what he got as grades? Because he became a multi-billionaire, right? And we have a lot of young people who are in our schools that we discourage by giving subjective grades to, and we lose out on their skills or gifts that they have naturally because they don't focus on what we want to grade. So I think that we have to expand ourselves, look at the changing world around us, and adjust to what's, as best we can, what's coming. Because the jobs that we're training our children for are not the jobs that we see. They're not the jobs that we've experienced and the jobs that we see, but they do need life skills that goes across jobs, and something like knowing how to develop relationships, knowing how to show respect, knowing how to recognize what good character is versus bad character, knowing how to work together. I always ask myself the question, why do coaches can say practice starts at 4 o'clock, parents don't come down and complain, and he gets all the kids there at 4. The ones that show up at 4:15, he sends them home, right? Because it's a discipline that is going to keep them for the rest of their lives. And we have to begin to look at our classroom experience in a similar fashion. I'm not talking about being punitive, but to make an awareness and have high expectation of their behavior and their achievement, and measure it objectively so that they can be encouraged to continue to try. That's what I said.
While some parents may be in favor of implementing a new approach to grading, believing it will be more equitable, others may be concerned that it will water down requirements, expectations, and student motivation. Can you share your thoughts on how moving away from the traditional grading will impact students? Joe, let's start with you again, and then Tom will go to you.
Yeah, it's interesting. People think that's not an unusual assumption, that when you say, well, we're actually going to use a scale that's more mathematically sound, or we're not going to penalize students if they hand in something late, at least not in the grade. People worry that that's lowering expectations. What we found is, and when we talk to teachers, they actually say it's the opposite. That what happens is when a student, as Professor Guskey also talked about, when a student's grade reflects their level of understanding of the course content, and just because they came on time, or because they brought Kleenex boxes for the classroom, or because they raised their hand and answered questions, regardless of their learning, when those behaviors are not included in the grade, it asks students to be held accountable to their level of understanding of the course content. And it actually makes it more rigorous in many cases. So that's what we found as we've worked with teachers. I think what it's also doing is it's putting more onus on the student. So in other words, if you don't hand in something on time, rather than me take off 5 points, which for a lot of students, that's just fine. Instead, it's saying, well, you know what? You actually have to do the work still, and your grade will represent your level of understanding on that assessment. So now you're experiencing what happens when you turn it in late. You still have to do it. You're not there. You can't get out of it. You can't just get a 0. You can't just lose 5 points. You still have to do the work and the learning. And your grade is going to reflect whether or not you learned. What it also does is it increases rigor and expectations, because it prevents, it sort of the magic of it is that it stops all the homework copying. When we interview students, when we partner with schools in all kinds of different ways, part of what we do is we interview students about their experiences with grades. And what they tell us, every student has copied homework. And why do they copy homework? Because they had a late soccer game, or they had to work, or they had 4 tests the next day, or whatever, or they weren't feeling well. And they knew that if they handed in homework late, they would lose points. Now what you do is you say, well, you know what, if you hand it in late, or if you hand in late, I'm not going to take off points, but you still have to hand it in. So now students have no incentive to copy, because the learning is based only on their understanding, not when they handed in the homework. And teachers find actually that students do increased levels of homework and increased learning when they don't have the deadline. So now, rather than truncate a student's learning and say, well, you know, give me the best you got because it's due, you say, okay, well, if you need an extra day or two, I'm going to let you continue learning. And now you don't have to copy. You don't have to feel the pressure of copy. You can keep learning. And so the students actually take greater ownership over their learning, which is, in many aspects of the professional world, that's how it works. When I've got a deadline to hand in an article and it's not the way I want it and it's due, I email the editor and I say, well, would you like it now? Or can I have an extra 2 days and I'll make it better? And every time they say, take the 2 days. What matters is the quality of the work and the quality of what your thinking is. And then we'll deal with the missed deadline later. But I want you to have the maximum amount of learning opportunity.
Tom?
Yeah, I think Joe's exactly right, on target with those comments. The idea is that we need to let students know that these things are important, that it is important that you keep timelines in mind, that you turn in things on time. And it is important you do your homework, like going to practices for an athletic event. But the idea is that what brings us greater honesty and clarity and meaningfulness in grades is if we report that separately. You can't just say to kids, well, homework doesn't count anymore, because then they won't do it. What you say is it counts, and it counts more because we're going to report it separately. Not only on the report card, but also in the transcript. That we're going to carry these things over to the transcript. So if you want the college admissions people to know that you're irresponsible, that you can't keep timelines, that you don't show these kind of good employability skills, we're going to let them know that. And what it does is it helps students understand that these things are important. But on the other side, it brings greater clarity to the curriculum and the learning goals. When we pull these non-academic factors out of an achievement grade, the teachers start looking more carefully at those learning goals and those learning expectations. They ask questions about, is this sufficiently rigorous? Are we expecting as much more students as we should? Should we be altering the things we're doing within the curriculum? So it's a sort of plus on both sides. It doesn't diminish the rigor of the curriculum in any way. It brings clarity to that, which can actually make it more rigorous than we had before, because we're looking at it in a very honest and straightforward fashion.
So let me ask the rest of the panel. These gentlemen have some ideas on changing or altering the way we grade. How do you see the impact on students if we change the grade? Dana, do you want to go first?
Sure. How did you know? So I am the product of an excellent public school district in Rockland County, New York, which is not far from where I live now. And so I have had experience with that traditional mode of grading, but my teaching experience was in an independent school where we had more flexibility, and the focus was on developing or cultivating intrinsic motivation, with the view that grades could actually, the traditional grading system could actually be a deterrent to healthy, the development of healthy motivation. Grades it's an extremely complicated issue. There are trade-offs. I can tell you that when, as an English teacher, I would always announce to my students that grades are the enemy of good writing. And I would wait. And so writing was a process, because it was really important that the grade and the fear and the anxiety around the grade not stop them from becoming the writer that they could become. That's specific to English.
Bob?
Yep. Now that I've had the opportunity to hear everyone else, I can see that grading, having a grade tells you a little bit about the story of the single grade. But I would encourage people having an opportunity, and the example that we used was that have a student have the complete learning experience by having to experience doing their homework.
Mhm.
If we had to go to a tutor or whatever to get an understanding of that particular work is probably more important, and it's important enough where it helps him for the rest of his life, because now he learns that it's okay not to know, but it's not okay to move forward without knowing that, you can't, there's no easy way out. I use an example of when I was going over my own life, and I was trying to figure out, when did I learn how to do geometry? So I have a friend who was in engineering, and he says, remember when we used to have to stay after school in Mr. Mortis's class? And he says, that was geometry. And he says, and he wouldn't let you leave until you knew how to do geometry. And he said, and you were always trying to get to basketball practice. That's how you learn geometry, right? Because someone cared enough to want me to understand geometry. And it was that teacher. And, the carrot was, you can't leave until you understand it. And I got help from other students, but I did understand geometry when it came to testing.
Well, Bob, I was bad at geometry and playing basketball. So I don't think it would have helped me. Drew?
Well, I just wanted to say that it seems to me that some of this talk of separating grades into the different categories is a bit academic, because any assignment is going to have a rubric, so the student knows how the grade is being formulated. And any grade in a grade book is going to be a compilation of the disparate elements that went into that grade. So I mean, certainly separating out the grade into different categories is done in elementary school, where a teacher has 30 students. For a high school teacher who has 150 to 180 students to have to give all these different grades, I heard what Professor Guskey said, that it's really not much more work, but it sure sounds like a heck of a lot more work to me. And I grade holistically, as I've been trying to say. I don't grade in this cookie cutter way, because students come to me as seniors with English proficiency that is really appropriate, maybe for the 4th or 5th grade. But that student can do really well in my class if that student engages and tries and thinks and finds a way to share his or her thoughts with me. I will appreciate that. And that student may go on to really be successful in life because they can think. Now, it's true, I draw upon my background as an actor every day in class, and I try to stimulate the kids and get them involved. And just the other day, I had a young lady look up at me and say, I feel sorry for you. But that's okay, because they know I'm trying. And if they're there, I say, you got up in the morning, you made it here, you got dressed, there's nobody naked in the classroom. So you, to some extent, want to be here. Now, all you have to do is think and make a personal connection, and you'll be fine. Yes, we can work on your grammar. I also teach college. I'm working on grammar with those students, and syntax, and how you can better express yourself and stop using indefinite pronouns. All these things are
I'm gonna
important
draw
to
you
a
back a
writer,
little bit.
yes. But to cookie cutter up the grade doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense to me.
Okay. Tom, do you want to address that?
Yes, let me add sort of a personal story with this, and maybe to clarify the issue. I have a son who's very bright, and I like to think he got it from me. But he's also very obstinate, and that he definitely got from his mother. In high school, he and I fought this constant battle because he gets math in ways that are just unknown to me. I mean, I'm okay in math. He's amazing at math. It just comes to him. And so in high school, he's taking advanced placement calculus. And he comes to me and says, all right, homework. Homework is designed to provide you with extended practice for the things you get in class, right? I say, yeah, that's right. He says, okay, if I get it in class, I can show the teacher I've got it. Why do I have to do this stupid homework? He said, if I go to class and all the teacher really does is goes over what's in the book, and I can read the book and get it, why do I need to go to class? This kid, he would not do homework. He'd skip class. He wouldn't leave school. They just find him in the tech lab doing something he thought was more important. So he's taking advanced placement calculus. The first year he takes the AB exam and he gets a 5, which is the highest grade you can get. The second year, he takes the BC version of the test. Not only does he get a 5, he's one of 38 kids in the country who gets a perfect score. But he got C's in calculus because his teacher zinged him because he wouldn't do the homework. And we fought this battle constantly. And I said, oh, Michael, you have to understand, it's a game. He said, Dad, that's my point. It's their game, not mine, and I don't want to play. This kid, all right, now I know teachers say to me, but we need to be teaching these kids responsibility. And I go along with you on that. I mean, and I will be the first one to admit my kid acted in an irresponsible way. But you cannot convince me that my kid deserves a C in calculus, not what it is to 5 on the AP. And that's why separating these elements becomes so important to contributing to the accuracy, the meaningfulness, and the equity of grading programs overall.
So with that, should we include, Tom, you seem to say we should separate it out, but should behaviors be included in grading? Should we grade behaviors at all? Like not handing in papers, I suppose, or doing your homework wrong, or being tardy with it. Joe, I know you had a few things to say about that too, but should we include those? We had talked about sort of that in the purpose. Do we include behaviors in grades?
Well, I think behaviors are certainly an aspect. I mean, but it's a process criteria. These are behaviors that enable learning, but don't represent learning per se. So our first step has to be to define the purpose of the grade. If we say that a grade is to represent how well students have learned and what they can do in terms of specific academic achievement goals, then that's one thing. But then that means we have to report these other things separately. And not that they're unimportant, but we just need to not contaminate a grade that's supposed to represent their achievement with these other behavioral factors that don't really represent how well they've learned and are able to do the things we ask them to do.
Joe, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I would argue that behavior should not be included in the grade at all. And yet we still want students to learn those behaviors. And so a lot of people think, well, gosh, if you don't include it in the grade, students won't do it. And at first that is true, because we have taught students that the only reason you do these behaviors is because you get points or you lose points. We have trained students to act in particular ways only for the points. And as extensive research we've determined, once you take away the points, then you stop the behavior, right? So initially that's what happens. But once you start helping students understand that the only thing that matters is their level of understanding of the course content, a number of things happen. So one is the example that Professor Guskey just described, right? The homework is for the student. It is not for the teacher, right? So this is homework that I have designed as a teacher that you should practice and you will do better on the performance. It's just like shooting free throws in your driveway. Nobody is counting up the number of free throws that you make and then bringing it to the game and saying, hey, can you add these points to the game? You practice for no points, because you know that by doing it, you will learn more, right? And for some students, that is true. And for some students, it may not be true. And for some students, it might be true on certain days, but not on others, right? Maybe I have 30 math problems to do, but maybe I only need to do 10 of them to know whether or not I've learned enough to be ready for the next day. Other students may say, I got 30, I actually need more because I'm not ready yet. So what this is about is helping students understand the means of learning and not making everything an ends where everything is rewarded. And another example is participation, right? So a lot of teachers will say, well, it's really important for students to learn by participating, by raising their hand, by speaking in a discussion, things like that. Well, that may be true for some students, but it's not true for every introverted student. And there is no reason why we would want to penalize or reward a student who may feel it very, very difficult to speak, but still be able to learn in that way. And many times what happens is that teachers bring their own biases to it, right? Teachers will create an archetype that in their head of what it looks like to learn, right? And usually it's a projection of what they look like when they learn, or what sort of culturally in dominant culture is what learning looks like. And they will impose that and compare students to the archetype, right? So if you raise your hand, you're learning, and I'll give you points. And if you don't raise your hand, you're not learning, so I don't give you points. And what we find is that actually students then treat the classroom like a performance space. They compete to raise their hands irrespective of whether they're learning. They're just trying to get the points because that's what is rewarded, right? The raising of the hand is an end. It's not a means to the student because we're rewarding it independently. What instead teachers will do is this. They will say, okay, we're going to create a little fishbowl in a discussion, and we're going to have people sit on the outside and people look on the inside. And the people on the inside are in the discussion. And the people on the outside, I want you to tally when different people speak. And then they reverse it the next day. And then, okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to take a quiz. And we're going to see if there's any correlation between the amount of participation that someone had and their score on the quiz. Because that's my hypothesis. If you participate more, you will learn more. And they do it, and then they put up the graph and they see a trend. Oh, interesting. The more you speak, the more you learn. That's very interesting. Why might that be? And then you have a discussion with the class. And then as a teacher, you say, and you know what was really interesting? We had 3 students that didn't talk at all and got some of the highest scores. How could that be? I thought we saw a trend. And they'll say, well, maybe the student didn't feel well that day, or maybe they are shy, or maybe whatever, right? And you say, and interestingly, there were 3 students who talked a whole lot and they scored very low. How could that happen? And the classroom talks about how could that happen, right? And so what you're doing is you're helping students understand that just like going out and shooting free throws for no points builds your skills to perform, whether or not you raise your hand may help you learn more, but not necessarily. And so it helps students better understand what they need and what helps make them successful. Because when they go to college, no one is checking how many times they raise their hand as they prepare for the exam. When they go into the professional world, no one is making sure that they finish their homework, right? You just have to be ready for the next day. And if we can help students understand how they best learn by taking away all of this extrinsic motivation for every atomized part of learning, we actually empower students and give them agency over how they learn best and make them much more likely to be effective.
Would somebody like to address that, or should we, we're running out of time.
Okay, no, I think that was very in depth, right? And I think a lot of us can carry something away with us for our students, because to empower students is the end game, or the success of the game, that they become lifelong learners. And that's what businesses want. That's what the world needs. And I think he addressed it very well.
Yeah, I would add to that the idea that education, we all know, it cannot be one size fits all, despite our need to address the practicalities of education. But every single student is an individual and will have individual strengths and weaknesses that grading won't be able to attest to. And I think that is a really essential point, that unique students are unique learners, and grades don't recognize that.
Well, grades
Just briefly.
recognize the individual achievement. And a student, as Joe was explaining, may not be behaving in an expected way, and it may be because of something on an IEP, and the teacher better be aware of that and should understand that, so that if we look at each student as an individual and allow them to self-actualize, that is the most important thing. Now, grades, I know Joe also brings up, what are we really grading? Why are we doing an average when we want to see where a student ends up? That's a very interesting aspect of grading as well. But we also don't want to push toward high stakes testing because we know all the deficiencies of that and how many students don't do well there. So that's why I think holistic grading is the answer.
Okay. Although, Joe, I don't know if you're in a law firm and they say, have something done tomorrow or the next day, I'm not too sure they're gonna give you the extra day. Maybe.
There are continuances all the time in court.
Absolutely. I know it wasn't, I was just teasing you a little bit. You did mention participation. So my next question has to do with attendance. Many schools are re-examining their attendance policies. Does class attendance matter? If a student has achieved proficiency in a comprehension of the subject, does it matter how many classes that student has attended? Does it matter if that student has attended at all? Or does attending class offer something besides proficiency that is important to schooling? For example, discussion, debate, insights from the teacher and the students. Dana, do you want to start with that one?
Attendance is absolutely necessary. I sympathize with the brilliant students who can achieve the 5 on the AP and get the C in calculus. I have seen those students, but attending class trains them to get along with others, to see how other people learn. And it might be boring sometimes, and it might be elucidating other times. And I think at the very least, the students will gain compassion for different kinds of learners.
Tom? Is attendance?
I agree exactly with what Dana said. There are so many things, and we've learned this in a very dramatic way as we went through COVID, how important that kind of class interaction is, both among students and between teachers and students. And so I think that is a really important part of our learning goals and what we want students to gain from the learning experience. But again, that's something other than just achievement of particular learning goals for a course. And so if we want to build those in, which I think we should, that's an important sort of aspect of the school learning experience. We probably need to give some indication of that away from or separate from just a grade that would represent how well they've mastered our identified curriculum, the learning goals within that curriculum.
Joe, how do you feel about attendance?
I'm for it. I mean, I would read just what Professor Guskey said. I mean, attendance is really important to learning, and it shouldn't be collapsed into part of the grade, because then you start warping the accuracy of the grade and make it very confusing about what the grade represents. But you should still report it. You can still communicate that to parents and caregivers and other groups.
I'd like to use an example. My son is a professional musician. And if you asked him whether attendance and being on time was important, he would tell you that it's very necessary to be on time if you want to keep a job. And I'm going to go all the way back to what we talked about in the beginning. We're preparing young people for real life situations that they're going to encounter. And why would we want them to be penalized? Because we forgot to give them the importance of being part of a class, being on time, because that's an expectation in any kind of job. It's just like you mentioned, being a lawyer and missing a deadline, right? You know, that's important. So if a child says, I want to be a lawyer, you got to make sure that he or she understands that deadlines and having work completed when it's supposed to be completed, even if you have to spend the night at the job, right? Because that's what you get paid to do. That's the compensation. So if we don't help them begin to understand, just like a coach helps players understand that if you don't take foul shots or practice your foul shots, you won't be on television playing, because the other kid that is on television, you don't see him. He's somewhere in the world, but he's practicing his foul shots. That's how he gets there. And we have to help our children here in this country understand that we're preparing you for real life situations. And yeah, grades are good, but life skills become just as important, if not more important. And if we don't demonstrate it in our communities, if we don't demonstrate it in our schools, if we don't expect it, then they can't move on. And we owe it to them, and we owe it to their parents to set a bar that every child is expected to reach and help them get there and overcome their barriers as much as we can to help them do that. But as a community, that's our responsibility. It's our responsibility to create our future workforce, our future volunteerism group, our future teachers, our future firemen, our future police officers. We've got to model that every day. And how do we conduct ourselves, and what expectations do we have of ourselves? Because if we don't have high expectations of ourselves, then what are we modeling for our children?
Can I just add one thing to that, just to clarify? Because I sort of
Please, we'll hold our applause if you would. Sure,
I'm
go ahead.
sorry. I didn't mean to cut off Mr. King's applause. I'm sorry. I couldn't hear it. I just want to be clear. Like, I'm not saying that deadlines never matter and it's never important to be on time. I'm not saying that, right? But just like there's no research that suggests that the people who came late tonight had teachers who didn't grade hard enough on deadlines compared to the people who did come on time tonight, right? But the panelists all were on time, and audience members came in at different times, and some weren't on time, and that's okay. And what we want to do is teach students when the deadline is critical and you have to meet it, and when it's not as important. And we want to teach them those critical thinking skills to be able to distinguish those. It's not that we just say every deadline is equally important and everyone loses points if you don't make it, because that's actually not what we want to teach them about the real world. That's not how the real world operates, right? I guarantee if a student wants to play in that game on Friday night, they're going to get there on time, right? And if they're trying to get a particular opportunity to go out with someone, they're going to be on time to the party, or if maybe they're fashionably late, so they know what time to get there, right? Students are very savvy about that. And we want to keep them focused on distinguishing when deadlines matter hugely and when we actually would deprioritize deadlines for the sake of learning, right? And reporting those separately helps us better communicate to students that there is a distinction between when you come on time and when it matters and when learning is actually more important.
Yeah. And if I could just extend that, students need to know there's consequence to what they do or they don't do in school. But that consequence doesn't always have to be reflected in the grade. And so instead of a policy that says a day late, a grade lower, your policy says if you don't turn it in on time, then your attendance is required today after school in a special study session where you will work to complete that assignment. No excuses accepted. What that does is it channels the student in a manner that says, we know this is a problem for you. We are going to take some steps to help you remedy that problem, rather than just punish them with a low grade. And so please do extend the notion of there being consequence to it, but have those consequences related to remedying the inappropriate behavior rather than just punishing students in a way that's unrelated to that.
Okay.
Well, just to give a personal example, in my classes, students know that I will not take off points for late work. I want to value the work as highly as I possibly can. But I do give them 2 hard, immutable deadlines. One is at the midpoint of a marking period, and all the work up to that point must be turned in. And for the the second hard and fast point is at the end of the marking period. So if for whatever reason, they're still working on it, or they haven't been able to get to it, or they haven't been well, or they've been overwhelmed in another class, or whatever it is, they have the time they need to do the best that they possibly can. But they also have a hard and fast deadline that they know. And again, when I discuss this with my students, they feel it's fair and they accept it.
Let me ask another little bit different grading question. Currently, with the current systems, are the grades too arbitrary, subjective decisions by the teacher? Or is there a human element to evaluation and assigning a grade that can't be standardized? And I think the question is, how much autonomy do you give the teacher in grades, in grading? Anyone want to go first?
Well, I know from the reading I've done of Joe's work and Professor Guskey's that they feel, and I feel, that grading as much as possible should be motivational, not punitive. So it is true that even though we have rubrics and we have standards, students come with such varied readiness that I think it is only human and proper to want to show a student as much appreciation as possible for their effort and their achievement. And again, I'm not a math teacher. I know in math or science or other subjects, you got it right, you got it wrong. Okay. But I don't think it's wrong, even when we're talking about the tracking, even when we're talking about honors level kids and college prep kids, to appreciate the student's effort, appreciate the quality of their thinking is important. And I think it's natural for a teacher to subsume that into their grading practice.
And you were a teacher, should grades be more standardized, or is it important for a teacher to put an input, even though some may be subjective?
I would say that we have to remember that teachers are human beings, just like students are human beings. And that as much as we are going to try to standardize, and I think we should standardize our grading, there will always be a subjective factor. As much as we use rubrics to communicate what it is that a student is doing well and what a student needs to do to improve. In my teaching practice, my goal with grading was always informative. It was to communicate, as I said earlier, strengths and weaknesses, and not to punish, but to inspire students to see where they could improve, and then come talk to me about where they can improve. So I think that answers your question.
You want to jump in?
Well, I'll take it from a parent's perspective. All right. As a parent, the thing that I worried about the most was that the teacher was being objective versus being subjective, because I didn't want my child penalized for me sitting on the Board of Ed or some other activity that I may be in. And I think, and also I worried about a little bit about bias, right? Because there was an incident for one of my children, who's now a successful educator himself, but a teacher was using a method of grading that was mathematical, which she didn't realize that my wife was a math major and she understood mathematical equations, and that when she was trying to explain it. So as teachers out there, understand, you're going to run into people whose job it is every day to do mathematical ratios, and that you can't fool them. And my wife was one of those people that you couldn't fool. So I think it's very, very important for teachers and anyone in that profession to make sure that they become as objective as possible as they do their grades, and recognize that they may bring to the table biases, but keep those biases in check, right? And recognize that the world is looking at you, because whatever you put on that student is what they're going to carry for life. And I tell you, I can look around this room and I can ask you a question. You remember the teacher that you liked the most, right? And you know the teacher that you were afraid of the most, and you know the teacher that you just didn't like, right? Well, I've been out of school for many years. And I was talking to some of my classmates, and we were talking about Miss Sovic, who was our 5th grade teacher. We still remember her. But you know what she used to do to show that she was objective? She would line us up and she would have a spelling bee. And if you could always misspell the word, but if you misspelled it the same way someone else did, that meant you weren't paying attention, and she penalized you, right? So that's what, and you know, you laugh, but what that did for me, it made me focus on what was going on around me. She didn't ask me, you know, because she wanted us to know that your responsibility is not to make the same mistake that someone else did when you had the option not to, right? So you always worry. So, hey, teachers play a major role in the development of our students. And I want to encourage teachers to continue to do the work they do, but also recognize that we're depending on you because you have the future generations in your hands. Okay,
Bob. Joe, how do you feel? I mean, you know, as they said, teachers are human. Are grades too arbitrary? Is that an issue? Do we need to standardize them more?
Well, I mean, I think in your question, should teachers have autonomy or should it be standardized, is really a false dichotomy, because teachers are the ones in the best position to bring their professional judgment to determining their own students' level of understanding of their own curriculum. So no one is in a better position than that teacher to decide what grades the student should have. And yet we want to make it so that it is not dependent on the student's teacher for the grade that they would get, right? We would expect that regardless of which Algebra 1 teacher you have, as a student, if you have identical performance, you would get the same grade. And what's happened, unfortunately, is because teachers don't get any training in how to grade, most teachers are creating their own unique system of grading. And so a student over the course of a day will have multiple different ways of being graded. And that will add to the cognitive load. So now I not only have to understand everything in the class that's being taught, but I now have to navigate every unique teacher's grading system. And if we can help and equip teachers with better understanding the research, I think that they have the opportunity of creating less grading systems that are more coherent across classrooms, not identical, but coherent and not in contradiction to each other. And they can also be less biased. And there is a lot of subjectivity that's brought to the grade. And of course it is, because this is a human endeavor, this teaching experience and learning experience. But just like a teacher will say, okay, I want everyone to write their name on the back of the paper. That way, when I look at the papers, I may have opinions and feelings about students that I may not even be aware of, but I want to protect the student from any biases they might bring. Many teachers do that. And I think we can even get better at that if we create rubrics and clarity around what the expectations are for students and what the gradations of performance are, and then have ways where teachers can calibrate with each other. So how about we have all the Algebra 1 teachers get all the tests that are given for a particular unit and shuffle the tests and have teachers grade model tests, first of all, to calibrate. So if a student did this, this is how well they would do. And now let's distribute those tests across all the teachers so that teachers aren't bringing their subjectivity and bias into that grading. I just think there are a lot of things we can do to help teachers calibrate around their expectations, create more coherent grading systems, and therefore reduce bias, but still preserve all of their autonomy.
Huh?
Yeah, Joe makes the point exactly, and I say the same. When we ask teachers and parents and kids about grading, and what they consider the element that's most unfair, it's the lack of consistency among teachers within the same school. That as kids go from class to class, all the rules can change. The purpose of grading changes, what comes part of the grade, all that changes. Now, some students see this as a huge game, and they become strategists in the game, want to understand it well and how to play. And some are very, very good. But for a lot of kids, it's a total mystery. And so before the report card comes out, their parent turns to them at the dinner table and asks, "What grade are you going to get in this class?" And they respond, in all honesty, "I don't know." If it's supposed to be a communication device, we're just not serving that purpose very well at all. And it really doesn't come down to like objectivity or subjectivity. It more relates to consistency. Would equally competent and skilled and knowledgeable teachers look at the same body of evidence on student learning and come up with the same grade? And if we can say yes to that, then we have a system that's at least leading to consistency in the way we provide this kind of feedback to students. If equally competent, skilled, and knowledgeable teachers look at the same body of evidence and don't come up with the same grade, well, that's a problem. And so it's helping teachers understand a common purpose to the grade, what it's supposed to represent, and then follow through with, as Joe said, really clear rubrics of what they're looking for and how they're going to judge the quality of students' performance.
Okay. During the pandemic, Stamford Public Schools discontinued its high school midterms and final exams and may not bring them back. Are graded end of term exams good indicators of achievement and comprehension, or should schools no longer use them? How should end of term competency be measured? Joe, you want to go with that one first? Should we do away with the end of term tests?
Well, I mean, I think that what's important is that when a teacher gives an assessment, that the purpose of that assessment is for the teacher to best understand what the student's level of understanding is of that course content. And to do it at the end is one way to do it, because presumably you've taught everything. So you want to get them at the very end, because that way they'll have the maximum amount of learning that they can show. And for some students, that may be a great opportunity for them to share what they know. And for other students, that may not be the best way for them to demonstrate that. Again, the purpose of the grade is to represent a student's level of understanding of the course content. The test or the assessment that a teacher uses is a means by which a teacher can ascertain that understanding and report it, because it's the teacher's job to report where students are in their learning. So if a student takes a final exam and does poorly on it, and the teacher knows they actually know more than what was represented on that assessment, maybe in the review day, the day before, or the previous quiz, and they do badly on that test, the last thing a teacher would want to do is put invalid data into the grade book, because now what they've done is they've said, well, I guess you know more than the test showed, but unfortunately, I have to now incorrectly describe your level of understanding, right? What this work is about is helping the teacher recognize that their job is not to enter scores of assessments. Their job is to report a student's level of understanding of the course content, in which the assessments a teacher gives are a way to do that. And the teacher then becomes actually more professionalized, because they're able to say, this assessment is the best way that I can understand what's in this kid's head. And actually for this kid, that assessment won't do that. I need to do this kind of assessment for that kid. And maybe for these kids, I'm going to give them a choice. How can you best represent your level of understanding? That way, it's not dependent on whether I made the perfect test, or whether a student had a good day that day or wasn't feeling well or missed lunch. It is now dependent on how the teacher is able to use a body of evidence that they're able to collect to most accurately and validly and reliably describe a student's level of understanding. So the short answer is it can be helpful, but it is not necessarily the best way for every student to show what they know.
There's alternatives to having end of term tests. Okay.
Well, yes. I mean, just as Joe said, it's very risky to use any single source of evidence in determining students' grade, because it can be tainted and affected by all sorts of influences outside of what the student actually controls. But even to get back to the point that Andrew talked about earlier, having these deadlines at the end where we say we want students to provide us with evidence at this point in time to really be a culminating learning experience. And so the final doesn't have to be sort of sit down, take exam. It can be a project. It can be a demonstration. It can be a sort of composition or a report that they put together over time. I've given them feedback as they do it along the way. And so when it gets to the end, it's this combination of things being pulled together. Plus, I think the advantage of it too, and Andrew brought this up as well, that we gets us away from this averaging part. If we say that our purpose is represent what our students have learned and are able to do at this point at the end, then how they did at the beginning of the marking period doesn't matter. We're going to get rid of that. We're going to give them the chance to make that up and really demonstrate how well they've learned this. When I say to my graduate students, look, here's the deal. Do better on the final than it did on the midterm, I throw out the midterm. I mean, why not? Why would I lower your grade because of poor performance halfway through if you can come back at the end and show me you got it? But that exam doesn't have to be sit down and tell me everything you know about this course in 2 hours. I can allow students to demonstrate their learning in lots of different ways. And I think bringing that to the table and discussing how best students can represent their learning is really a meaningful conversation that we probably want to engage in.
I just wanted to add that part of the reason for this is why we average, because we're not trying to focus on any one assessment that heavily. However, you have the drawback of an average may not represent where a student has ended up. One possible idea that's just occurring to me is that the final assessment might only be used if it raises a student's grade. If the student is able to show, well, I struggled, but now I've got it, or I was doing well and I had a bad day, or I, for whatever reason, didn't do well on that final assessment. I don't think it's a bad idea to just, as Professor Guskey was saying, throw it out. The key is to be able for the student to feel that they have progressed. And that's one of the reasons why teachers felt as strongly as they did about wanting to have the AB over the 4x4, because even though it was the same amount of class time in the 4x4, it wasn't in real life. And the student has the year to grow and assimilate the information. And that I think is important to be able for them to know, as well as the teacher and the parents, but for the student to know that they have progressed.
Should we do away with interterms? Are they a good tool?
I think that they're a tool, but that they're limited. I also like the idea of recognizing that students would have different strengths and ways of demonstrating proficiency. I think it would be a mistake to do away with any kind of assessment for the very simple reason of not knowing whether they're ready for the next grade, whether they're ready to move on, or and I think we serve each student best if we know where they stand.
Bob?
Yeah, I think, and I was just thinking about the body of knowledge. If that's the goal, we have to measure it. And I guess testing would be the best way to measure that, because it would be an encouragement not only to the teacher to know that they shared enough information that was captured, but it would be empowering the student to know that they have enough basic knowledge to move on to the next course or to tie it together with other courses. I think learning is a very tricky thing, but like there's no part of our society where people aren't measured. And I think that the classroom gets us ready to be measured, right? So yeah, I think there should be some form of grading, or at least testing the level of knowledge of each individual student.
Thank you. So we're going to go to some audience questions, and then we'll have maybe one last question. A question from the audience. What are your thoughts about how grading based on end of course mastery affect students who showed high levels of mastery throughout the course?
Well, we just addressed that, really, didn't we?
I'm not sure. Anybody want to take that one?
Well, I can add one personal story that indicates sort of a drawback to this. I began in education as a middle school teacher. I taught grades 7 and 8. And in the middle school where I taught, we gave final examinations to our 8th graders. We thought this was a good idea. We thought we would get them ready for what they were going to face in high school. And I remember so well the first year I did this because I was standing outside my class waiting for one of my 8th grade class to come in. And down the hall comes my superstar, Jessica. She had done so well the entire semester. And as she came into the room, I said, "Hi, Jess, how are you?" And she said, "Fine." I said, "Jess, did you study for your exam?" She said, "No, not really." I was stunned. I said, "Jess, how could you not study for your final exam? This is such an important part of your grade." And she looked at me really quizzically and said, "Well, Mr. Guskey, I worked it out. I only need a 50.2 on my final to get an A. I don't have studied at 50.2. This 8th grader had worked it out to the 10th decimal place, what she needed to do to get the A in my class, and she was surprised that I didn't get it. And I thought, what have I done? I mean, for this brilliant young woman, school was not about learning, it was about getting the grade. And she had done her job, and she was surprised that I didn't understand. We need to consider those kind of things and the effects that it has on kids, especially when we're dealing with those really high achieving kids like that.
Yeah, but for her, the final exam wasn't about learning. It was about performance that she didn't feel she needed to do.
Okay. We'll just do a few more of these. Does not doing homework hurt classroom participation? Does it slow down the class because the unprepared students will have too many questions?
Can you repeat that?
Does not doing homework hurt classroom participation?
It can. So it depends what the purpose of the homework is for and being really transparent with students about what it's for. So if a teacher wants people to complete a reading before they come in the next day, they explain, look, here's what's going to happen. We're doing this reading so people are equipped to be able to have a conversation tomorrow. All right. And when you come in, I want to know whether or not you've done the reading, because I don't want to make you look silly if you weren't able to do it. But if you did it, you should be able to participate. And if you didn't do it, there'll be consequences. And so you have students come in and you see who's done it and who hasn't. And the people who haven't, maybe they have to go read over here. They don't get to be part of this discussion, or maybe they have to sit on the outside. I mean, there are all kinds of ways to address when students aren't able to complete the homework, and a way to invest homework with meaning and value. And it also depends on being able to be really have a lot of tools as a teacher. And many times teachers will use grades as a behavior management strategy, right? I need to make sure that something happens in my classroom. And so I'm going to give them points to make sure that happens in my classroom, because I'm not sure what I'm going to do if they're not doing what I want them to do, right? And that is a very reasonable way to use grades when you aren't sure what all the different ways there are to teach, right? Especially if you're a new teacher, right? You don't have a whole lot of skills coming into the classroom. So oftentimes new teachers will need to rely on those. And what this work is about is when we start critically examining how we've used grades as behavior management, it starts opening up opportunities to have teachers bring more of their creativity and more skills and more focus on how can I expand my pedagogical repertoire of things I can do in the classroom, so I don't use grades in this way.
Okay.
Yeah, I think using grades for behavior management would be anathema.
Drew, this one's to you. What do you do with a student who absolutely refuses to put any effort into your class? Can they pass?
If they refuse to put any effort in at all, how can they pass? Now, they may have gotten used to passing. That's how they ended up in my senior class. But it's nonsensical to me. No effort, nothing, nada. When all I'm asking you to do is think and share your thoughts with me, please. I mean, I don't get that. I don't get that. I mean, I want to be really real with you. Most students now, for whatever reason that I know, are not reading substantive amounts of literature on their own, if it's assigned or not. I have to formulate my classes, and this isn't just since the pandemic or during the pandemic, or this is, students are not excited generally about learning. They're not connected to it unless it's, and I'm even talking about high-performing students, it's extrinsic. They're not doing it for the love of learning like I have and was instilled in me by the teachers that I loved, for the most part. If they can catch that from me, fantastic. But I give them the space to learn in the classroom. We go through the literature together. We experience it. We discuss it. If you miss a class, it's on Google Classroom, then you've got to keep up on your own. But for the most part, homework is only what you haven't been able to finish in class unless it's a process piece essay. And even in the process piece essay, I'm giving you time in class to work on it so you can get my help as you're working on it. But of course, you can also work on it on your own. But we've got to be real here and understand where our students are at for the most part and what's going on with them. And man, they need motivation because they come into the classroom and an awful lot of them are ready to do nothing. And for some reason, they expect that they're going to pass. And that's not going to fly because it wouldn't, talk about real life lessons, that wouldn't fly in real life at all. Even in a relationship, you got to give something.
Drew, I'm gonna stop you there before we get into relationships. Something else I'm bad at. One more question to the panelists, and then we'll close up. And it's a little more of a philosophical question. Should schools be focusing on helping the greatest number of children, or should the focus be on requiring students to reach a certain level of achievement, even if it means some will not reach that level? Tom, you want to start us? What do you think? And it's not a leading question anyway, it's just curious.
Yeah. Well, I should probably preface my response by indicating that my advisor, the chair of my doctoral committee at the University of Chicago, was Benjamin Bloom. And Bloom wrote about this issue. Bloom in particular was very concerned about people who expressed the idea that as educators, we should be working to have children work and achieve to their potential. But he says, who knows what any child's potential can be? Whenever people start talking about working to potential, what they talk about is not expecting as much from some as we expect from others. And who is going to determine that? Who is going to say that? I mean, I go back and I think probably some of my elementary teachers, the fact that I'm not incarcerated today is probably a surprise to them. And they would think that I far exceeded my expectations and my potential. And I think that that's the challenge we have. Bloom also said that when we think of learning in any subject area, it's infinite. There's no limit to what you can learn in any academic discipline, but a curriculum is finite. When we identify a curriculum, we specify within an entire domain the things we think are most important for students to learn. And when we define that curriculum, then our job becomes helping all of our students learn that excellently, and we can do it. And so to be able to combine the idea that we don't have to sacrifice equity for the sake of excellence, we can have them together. And we can do it in a measured and calculated and purposeful way and not worry about the idea. Now, some kids are going to learn the curriculum and a whole lot more. That's great. But when we define that curriculum, we say, this is what we want all of our students to learn excellently. And our job then becomes facilitating that process.
Joe, I'm going to give you the last word, so hold on. Bob?
No, I agree with what Tom said, and kudos, great.
Dana? So what do we do? Is there an either or? Do you?
I don't think there's an either or. I think that our goal as educators and as parents is to expect the most, is to keep the bar high for everybody. I mean, when we think about, I go back to thinking about why we teach reading at all. I think about how books allow us to we see what's in the book, right? We observe what's in the book. We observe the text, then we interpret what's in the text, right? We try to make meaning, and then we think about that, right? Like the next level, a higher order, right? The sort of the judgment. Is it any good? I would find my students would read a poem and say, "Oh, this stinks," but they don't actually know what it says or what it means because they've jumped to the third level of kind of critical thinking. So I think that we need to teach students, and all students, that there are the ways to think. I mean, I go back to thinking about books are texts, but the world is a text, and everybody can read the world. We need to be able to think about the world in a critical way. So that's the goal of education.
Well, and the key to critical thinking and the key to creativity is making connections, text to self, text to text, text to world. Any student can do that. So when we're talking about standards again, and excellence, levels of excellence, should all students have to achieve the same level of excellence? Well, they're all individuals and they're all going to achieve what they achieve in their own way. And to expect every student to reach the same level of proficiency, at least I'm talking about English class now, in the same way, is not practical. But if that student comes to the end of the year and is better able to express themselves and feels more confident in themselves and says, you know what, I couldn't focus on this book. Focus, boy, that's a big issue. Couldn't focus on this book for 5 minutes at the beginning of the year. And now, oh my gosh, I get what's happening. I understand the motivation of the character because I went through something like that, or I have an uncle just like that character, or this happened in my neighborhood. That's success for that student.
Joe, you want to finish this off?
Well, I would also echo what Professor Guskey said, that it is not as if we are trying to say some students will be successful and we can't make them all successful, because if we do, we'll have to lower our standards. The bullseye doesn't get smaller if more people hit it, right? If you keep the target static, right? These are the standards that we expect every student to hit, then we can have every student meet that. And it is not compromising it's not making the bullseye get any bigger or smaller. We're keeping it right where it is and trying to get every kid to hit it. And I know that that's part of what a school district is by its very mission. It doesn't matter who you are. You come to us and we are dedicated to have every student hit that bullseye. However long it takes and whatever ways we can, with whatever resources we have available and whatever supports we can provide. And I hope that, in part 2 of this conversation, that the district also has folks that are part of this, because they have done a lot of thinking around this and a lot of research, and this is integrated into larger ways of thinking about what they want for every student who comes into their district. And it's just a false idea, I think, that is also sort of a residue of how we used to think about schools, when we wanted schools to sort, because we were trying to make sure who was going to work in the factory line, who just wasn't capable of really any kind of thinking, but just could work in our factories, right? We don't think that way about schools anymore. We want every student to have as many choices as possible. And we are the last ones who would say some students can make it and some students can't. And by having improved, more equitable grading, we actually bring that kind of clarity and match it to the way we think about every student being able to be successful.
Mm-hmm. Talk about students who can't follow instructions. I apparently am one and still am one. We have a little bit more time, so we're going to go through just a couple more questions. So sorry about that. Joe, I will give you or either Joe or Tom, I will give you the last word when we do end. Let me ask you this. Many people say that homework and grades cause excessive stress for students. But aren't students and consequences a major part of life? Should we be preparing students for their future lives outside the school by teaching them how to cope with and deal with stress, or should we take away that stress? Dana?
I don't think that taking away stress teaches anybody to deal with stress. So I'm very conscious of how much anxiety there is around testing and homework, and that we have a mental health problem among our young people. I'm very sensitive to that. At the same time, you know, the therapeutic advice is if the elevator scares you, you should get on the elevator, not avoid the elevator. So I think as teachers, we need to be nurturing and demanding and help students cope with the stress.
Bob, how do you?
I think I feel the same way. You know, it's like having a professional artist or athlete, right? You know, one of the things that, and I have, like I've said, I have a son that's in the business. And my first question to him was, what's it like to perform in front of 45,000 people? And he says, Dad, I'm just doing a show. I'm on stage, right? This is a kid that has learned to overcome all the stressful things. Now, I used to have to speak in front of 400 or 500 people. Sometime if it was the right 5 people, I'd be a nervous wreck, right? So I was judging his experience to what my experience was. But because he saw me navigate my experience, his experience was easier to navigate. He learned how to move through stress because he was just working. And I think that if you talk to high performance people, whether it's a quarterback with the 49ers or whoever your favorite quarterback is, they tell you as long as they have a minute in a game, they still believe they can win, right? And the nerves may be there, but they've overcome it. So with students, where did they learn how to do that? They learned how to do that in school, right? The child that doesn't get nervous because his homework isn't completed, right? He still comes to school and he'll let you tell him, say, well, you didn't do your homework. But he knows that, right? What he needs for you to say, I'm going to make you do, I'm not going to make you do your homework, but I want you to know I expect your homework to be completed. And you have until Friday to get it to me, right? So you give him another deadline. But at least he learns how to manage through the stress in my thought process.
True.
Well, on the other hand, teachers are trained and hopefully inspired nowadays to appreciate that a student who feels under stress may be experiencing that for many different complex reasons, which are not irrelevant to their performance in a classroom. And I would think any teacher worth their salt would understand that and do the best that they can to be sensitive to that, so that you're not going to try to push a student who's obviously in distress to do something that is not safe for them to do it at that time. Now, does that mean that students just get excused from an assignment? Well, as a matter of fact, I get emails all the time about having to make accommodations for students for one reason or another, and to work with them individually to see to it that they don't suffer because of that. So I think it's important, that it's an important aspect, the humanity of each student, the complexity of their lives has to be taken into account. Yes, that makes the life of a teacher a lot more complicated than maybe it was back in the Little Red Schoolhouse days, but it's worthwhile because it filters into their, what I was talking about before, their self-actualization, their self-confidence, and their ability to actually learn, which is what this is all about.
Joe, I think you and Tom in your papers and talk about stress, I believe, with your your method making it easier. Is that the case? How do you feel about stress and teaching kids how to deal with it?
Well, those are two different questions. Do you want me to talk about how I feel about teaching students about stress, or do you want me to talk about how equitable grading reduces stress?
Whichever you like, or you can do both.
So I think it's misguided to think, well, the world's going to be tough, so we better make it tough on them. Believing that is the way you prepare students, is you give them adversity on purpose so that they're ready for adversity later. They have enough adversity without your help in all kinds of ways. And I don't think we want to put teachers in the position of being stress maximizers. I think it can fray the relationships that we're trying to build between teachers and students, and which become critically important for student learning. And as it's been referenced, like, we have a real epidemic with students feeling stress and self-medicating or manifesting in really harmful ways. And I think the traditional grading system actually adds stress to students. What we found is when you don't grade students on everything they do, right? Because in a lot of classes, when you include participation, homework, whether you came on time, all these things, a student comes into class and they're being judged every moment of the period. And students will talk, as I've said, about classrooms as performance spaces. And I have to act in a particular way. I have to be a certain kind of person for the entire period because everything counts. And I can never be myself in a classroom because of that. And what teachers will tell us is when they stop grading every single behavior of students, students will tell them it just makes them be themselves. They can just be themselves in a classroom, and they can have a bad day. They can have a day when they don't feel like participating, and that's okay. And they can have a day when they're really excited to participate, and that's okay. And they don't get extra credit because they felt like speaking that day, right? They get to focus on, can I learn the content? And that students will talk about how they actually do better work when they're not stressed. The evidence is overwhelming that stress lowers performance. And so all the things we can do to de-stress our students in the learning process, the more likely they'll learn and the higher performance they'll actually have. One of the things we talk about is the benefits of multiple opportunities for students to demonstrate their learning, right? Redos and retakes. And what's interesting is teachers think that if I say there's going to be a retake, students won't take it seriously the first time. And what happens is instead that students actually do really well because they know that if they don't do well, they'll have a retake. They have much less stress during that assessment event, and they actually score better because they're not so stressed and they don't need the retake. So in all kinds of ways, we help to focus students not on the performance of learning, but the actual learning by using some of these ideas.
Tom?
Well, I think it is sort of ironic that we're in this conversation equating homework and stress. The important element here is to recognize that with homework, more is not always better. The relationship between the amount of time kids spend at homework and learning is not linear. There is a point of diminishing returns. And I'm a very strong fan of the work of Harris Cooper in this, who's done a lot of synthesizing of research on homework. And I love the work because it's so clear, but I also hate it because he told me everything I do is wrong. But the other part of it that I really like is he talks about this idea of diminishing returns, and especially relating time that kids have to devote to homework and how much they get out of it. And he talks about this general rule of thumb of about a 10-minute per grade level rule with it. That if you're talking about homework for third graders, and there's not a lot of evidence that indicates that homework really does anything for elementary kids, but maybe 30 minutes would be about the best. Beyond that, it becomes what researchers call an exercise in persistence. Especially with elementary children, we find that once it gets to that point, the kids aren't doing it anymore, their parents are doing it for them. Up to sixth graders, we're maybe an hour, to seniors in high school, up to 2 hours. That beyond that, you lose its effectiveness. And so what this requires is that as teachers, we be able to talk with one another, have opportunities to share, so that if a kid has 6 classes in a day, that not each one of us is assigning 40 minutes of homework that night. That we have to be able to share to keep it within that 2-hour limit. What causes stress is when kids come after soccer practice or play practice or music practice, and they come home and they figure they get 3 or 4 hours of homework to do that night. That's the stressful aspect of it. So how can we keep it manageable, purposeful, and effective? And I think one of the ways to do that is to provide more opportunities for teachers to share and talk with one another about what they're doing, what they want to accomplish. And maybe one night I need for my kids to work on an hour, but one of my colleagues will give up the homework for that night. And be able to provide for that collaboration among teachers would do a lot to reduce this stress that kids have to find as they look forward to hours and hours of homework each night.
Stephen? I just wanted to add about this idea of redos. In English class, redos are drafts. So it's natural to a process piece. And we combine that with peer editing, which I don't know if you're aware, the key to peer editing is having someone else read out loud to you what you wrote. Because hearing it in someone else's voice is so different than trying to read it in your own head. So in English, at least, we've got that built into our process.
I want to thank the panel for a very good discussion and thank the audience as well. I do recommend everyone go to Tom and Joe's, their various websites. There's a lot to learn. These gentlemen are very knowledgeable in these subjects, and I would recommend everyone take a look, see what they have to say. Brian, did you want to? Thank you, everybody.
We have a question.
No more questions. We're done.
So I do know that we'll be mingling. We have some dessert and coffee and some more music, and there will be opportunities to ask questions of the panelists as we linger. But we are going to close now. And I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. I think every person in this room cares deeply about education, cares deeply about our children, and clearly cares deeply about hearing different perspectives. And if that's what you value, there is more where that came from. Please check out FAIR, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, at fairforall.org, and the Prometheum Foundation, who also believe that our democracy, our world requires discourse. And thank you all for coming out. As I said, we will have time to mingle and people can answer questions up close and personal. And a special debt of gratitude to Ferguson Library and to Kenneth Goldberg, who helped to organize all of the different people who came together tonight. Thank you so much, Ken. And thank you all again. We have coffee, dessert, some more music. Stick around.